Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Croswell, Director General of Emergency Management Australia. I'm here to talk this morning just a little bit about a story about disaster and a story that teaches ethics. So here we go. My premise is simply this, that if we're going to navigate through catastrophe, we've got to change the way we think about the problems. So we've always approached disasters in a similar or the same way. We tend to yield the same result. Australia learnt some big lessons out of catastrophic disasters in its leadership. Very hard lessons that needed to be learnt, lessons that on some level have been learnt and are in fact changing the way we approach disaster, changing outcome. But it was only through the bitter experience that we came to understand that the way that we were approaching the issue was not necessarily beneficial. That's the basis of this story today. So, that's a bit of a picture of our landscape. Lots of pictures there, lots of fire, of course. Australia is a highly fire-prone landscape, one of the most fire-prone landscapes in the world. You can see some of those plumes of smoke there. I'll show you one here. This one here is in Tasmania in the southern part of Australia. That's in the process of forming its own thunderstorm. This picture here is in Canberra, in the ACT, in the nation's capital. It produced its own thunderstorm, a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, and put down a tornado spinning at 270 kilometres an hour, pushed through the suburbs of Canberra and destroyed 488 homes and killed 4 people. So we deal with very, very high intensity events. That's the New Zealand earthquake, that's the Brisbane floods, Victorian bushfires, and Cyclone Yasi in Queensland. So it just gives you a sense of the scale of the things that we deal with. So let me tell you the story. So in 2003, we had a major fire in Canberra. We lost, as I said, 488 homes, over $1 billion worth of damage, 4 lives. Clearly not successful. When we looked into that operation, there was a significant breach of public trust and confidence, a significant breach. And the reason it happened is principally because of this, is because we thought we understood the hazard space. We thought we understood fire. We attached messages to that understanding. We reassured the public that things would be okay. We wouldn't take advice from other people because we thought we knew. The fire manifested and it did not turn out the way we thought. So all of our public messaging and all of our reassurance to community ended up being wrong. People very, very unhappy. So unhappy we had court action, we had government on government arguments, people lost their jobs, people got very depressed because the impact on society was significant. And so you could label that operation very unsuccessful. We argued a lot about who was to blame. We argued a lot about who was at fault. And this is a bit of a journey of leadership, certainly in my world as a commander and a leader. 6 years later, we go to Victoria and we come to this fire here. And this fire cost 173 lives, 2,000 homes and just on $6 billion worth of damage. And again was deemed obviously not successful. And again, the biggest issue in Victoria was the lack of public warnings and information. So we had that experience in Canberra. We had the same experience in Victoria. We hadn't understood that we didn't understand everything about our hazards. So again, we thought we had its measure. We thought we had our messaging right, and clearly we didn't. We then go to Queensland. So we go to Cyclone Yasi and we go to the flooding. We lost 37 people. I'm not sure, I can't remember how many homes, but $13.5 billion worth of damage. Now, a little bit more successful in terms of leadership, but still heavily criticised for absence of knowledge, absence of understanding, absence of connection with people. So again, rated as not operationally highly successful. We then go across to the other side of the country, to Perth, and we had another bushfire. And this time only 87 homes, no lives lost, and under $100 million worth of damage, so quite a small fire. But so unsuccessful that they sacked the chief officer, sacked the chief executive, decommissioned the authority, rewrote the legislation, and re-established a government department over 87 homes. So the inquirer, the person who ran the special inquiry into that fire, asked the profound question. And the profound question was, how do you measure success? How do you measure success in disaster? He didn't answer that question, but he asked the question in his inquiry. And we had just gone through 4 catastrophic disasters that clearly in the public's context was unsuccessful. And as leaders, as commissioners, as chief officers, as director generals, serving governments, serving ministers, we had failed them on some level. We had positioned our governments for criticism. And that's not our role. Our role is to protect our ministers and protect our governments from that very thing that, of course, we're paid to avoid. So what was missing? So we had a look at these disasters and we realised that we were trying to measure them. So we were looking at property loss rates, death rates, economic impacts, all of those indicators which are very important, but that wasn't speaking to the people. It simply didn't speak to the people. So we were pitching at the wrong level. So we're measuring success from the head, not from the heart. So this is what we learnt. Sorry, what we learnt in these papers. I'll move fast this one. This is what we learnt. So if I just take you through it, this is our capability. This is what we're good at. So that's our fire trucks, that's our policies, procedures, legislation. So the yellow bar represents what we're good at. This represents what could happen. This represents what does happen. So in other words, it's potential and manifest consequence. So at a low level, our capability is much bigger than the consequence. So not much happens. So we're very good at that. So we don't lose many lives, we don't lose many property, we don't cost much money. We come up to a higher scale, we're still doing pretty good. We get to what we call a level of severe, and we hit level. And if you talk to our commissioners or chiefs, they'll say generally two things at that point. We're stretched to our limit and we dodged a bullet. And that's generally what they say. The problem in Australia is we have disasters in this category here, which go extreme and catastrophic. And when that happens, our capability stays here and the disaster exceeds us. It goes way past us. So what it's taught us is this. We have a limitation. We have a point of limitation. And we didn't know that we had that. So we always spoke as though we were limitless, as though we could deal with anything. But the reality is we can't. We had to learn that. And that's a big lesson for fire services, for police services, ambulance services, to accept they can't do everything. They can't be everywhere. They can't meet everybody's need. So we simply say this, that there's this notion of getting better, which is what we do know, and we need to continue to get better and to improve the things that we know about. But there's a thing called thinking differently. And thinking differently is up in this space here, very much up in this space here. So I want to talk briefly about risk. When we talk about risk, we talk about likelihood, we talk about consequence. And I want to talk about the paradox. So generally speaking, in catastrophic disasters, the least likely is the most consequential. Least likely implies you don't need to think too much about the problem. Most consequential implies the exact opposite. If you're in my world or in a commissioner's world, you have to deal with the consequence. You have to think about the worst case. Not only do you have to think about it, you have to position for it and make sure your governments are positioned for that event. And if you're not doing that as a leader in a government, you're not doing your job properly. So, what does all that mean? It means accepting inevitability. So anyone who has a hazard profile, any part of the landscape of this planet that has a hazard profile, that has a potential for the manifestation of a disaster, needs to be thought about as inevitability, not as about risk. If you're a leader that has to navigate through this, you don't get to choose the event. The events choose you. So there's no point trading off on likelihood because you don't control it anyway. Second point, I just spoke about it, the thing about residual risk. The least likely, most consequential, that's the paradox. Rarity reduces risk, it doesn't reduce consequence. A very important point of risk management. So you can use likelihood and consequence for your economic investments and your decisions around resources, but you cannot use it in leadership if you're responsible for navigating through consequence. What I really want to talk about today, though, very briefly, is the ethical premise. What all of those disasters taught is that we breached trust. We breached trust. And we advocate in Australia that the greatest measure of success in the management of disaster is the upholding of public trust and confidence. It has to be the highest measure. And everything that falls below that is to honour that public trust. And if we don't do that, then we're failing. And the big disasters taught us that. The second thing we learnt was the principle of unity. Partnering with the private sector, with the NGOs, with really the rest of the community was critical, and we should have given more thought to that before those disasters. So the principle of unity, we often say if you're not unified before a disaster, make sure you're unified during a disaster, because you won't be unified after it when everybody seeks to find out what actually happened. They taught us an enormous amount of humility. We thought we understood the hazard space taught us that we didn't. nature produced effects that were simply not found in science, that we simply did not know about them. And I can say as climate change takes effect, as the landscape continues to change in the atmosphere, those effects will become more prominent, more frequent. Things we don't understand will manifest more often. So an open mind to the problem is critical. The ultimate mission in this game has to be the reduction of human suffering. It has to underpin everything that we think, say and do. If we're not doing it for that reason, why are we doing it? A bushfire running across the landscape of Australia means nothing if no one's in the way. If it's not going to have an effect on humanity, if it's not going to have an adverse effect on the ecology or the environment, it's in fact not a problem. The irony in Australia is that fire is a natural part of the landscape. The fire in Canberra in 2003, which I showed you, which produced the tornado, was an ecological event. We happened to put a city in the path of it 100 years ago, but prior to that, it would have just run all the way to the coast and done its ecological job. So fire on the landscape in Australia is not a problem. It's only when it meets us it becomes the problem. And the fifth one I just want to briefly talk about is this notion of forgiveness. We saw so many people engage in debate, quite subjective debate about fault and blame. Now, all of us who stand in a position of leadership, whether it's at the top level, the middle level or the lower level, need to accept accountability. And that's different from blame. So if you step in a leadership position, accountability is part of it. Finger pointing is not very helpful. But what we learned about all these fires was this, that if you looked at the motivations of the people who were engaged in the operations, and that's directly or indirectly, primarily and principally, they were motivated to do the very best they could in the most adverse of circumstance within their limits and constraints. So the limits of their mind, the limits of their understanding, their knowledge, their skills, their experience, and the limits of their resources. It was hard to find anybody that wasn't motivated to do the best they could. If that is in fact true, and I think it's true of all disaster, then the question's got to be, is there room to blame anybody? And the answer has to be no. But if we don't learn to forgive, then we're deemed to repeat the same lesson again. And I'll just reflect back briefly to the gap between the Canberra fire and the Victoria fire, when all the blame happened. There was one critical lesson not learnt, and that was public warnings and information. It was absent in 2003. It could have been learnt in the 5 years following. It wasn't, because of a number of industry debates and blame seeking. And the same problem manifested in the next fire, but we didn't just lose 4 people, we lost 173 people. Such a profound lesson for the industry. So what I can say now is this: these ethics are filtering through leadership. We've talked a lot about them in Australia the last 4 or 5 years. We've had catastrophic disasters since. We had a fire in 2013 under catastrophic fire weather condition that took out 240 homes in 40 minutes. Nobody died, but nobody was sacked. The government's confidence remained intact. Community remained unhappy but satisfied all that could have been done. And the commissioner that led the operation was lauded for his connection to community. And the reason he was lauded is because he felt what the people felt. He spoke the language of the people, he travelled the road with the people, and he took them through the experience. So we learned something. So my message today in leadership, wherever you sit in leadership, is join the people in the journey. It's very important to understand what they're experiencing, what they're going through, and that has to influence your decision making. It has to influence everything that you think, say or do, because if you don't and you break that connection, they will judge you harshly, and rightfully so. It's part of accountability is to make the connection. So in Australia, we've learnt very hard lessons. We put our governments in difficult positions. We did manage to get through, but we had to take the lesson. The lesson for us is the ethical lesson. Many other things are happening, of course, but our leadership has changed its view. It's starting to make better connections, change its narrative, and be more heartfelt in its leadership. And ladies and gentlemen, that is my message this morning. Thank you.